The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 447 leveled at 35,000 feet. Marcus Caldwell sat in seat 2 of first class, his fingers hovering over the armrest as if touching it might prove he didn't belong there. The leather was soft, butter smooth, the kind of luxury he'd bought 1,000 times over for boardrooms and penthouses. But right now, under the sharp gaze of flight attendant Jennifer Walsh, it felt like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. She stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line so thin it could cut glass. Her voice had that sugary venom reserved for people who needed to be reminded of their place. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Marcus didn't move. His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed forward, fixed on the seatback screen that wasn't even on yet. This wasn't his first rodeo. He'd learned long ago that black men in expensive seats were guilty until proven innocent, and even then, the verdict was shaky. "I already showed it to you," he said quietly, evenly. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent 20 years learning how not to raise it. Jennifer's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I understand, but there's been a concern. Another passenger mentioned that someone might be in the wrong seat. Translation: you don't look like you belong here." The cabin was silent except for the hum of the engines and the rustle of a newspaper 2 rows back. Eyes were on him now, curious, judgmental, indifferent. Marcus felt the heat crawl up his neck, that familiar cocktail of rage and resignation that tasted like swallowing nails. He pulled out his phone, called up the boarding pass with 3 taps, and held it up without a word. Jennifer leaned in, squinting at the screen like she was deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. Her expression flickered just for a second before snapping back into place. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped. "But I'm still going to need to verify this with the gate." That's when Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her falter. Not anger, not defiance. Something worse. Patience. The kind of patience that comes from being tested 1,000,000 times and deciding, each time, not to burn the world down. "Go ahead," he said. "Verify it. And if you think this moment is tense, stay with me. Because what happens when she finds out who he really is will shatter everything you thought you knew about power, pride, and the price of being underestimated." Jennifer turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her pace just a fraction too quick to be casual. Marcus leaned back in his seat, exhaling through his nose, and closed his eyes. He could feel the stairs still clinging to him like static. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered. He thought about his daughter, Zara, who was 8 years old and still believed the world was fair. He thought about the meeting waiting for him in London, a merger worth $4.3 billion that would cement Caldwell Enterprises as the largest black-owned aviation company in the world. He thought about his mother, who used to clean planes like this one for minimum wage, who told him once, "Baby, don't ever let them make you small. You hear me? You take up space." Jennifer returned 5 minutes later. Her face was pale, her hands trembling just slightly as she held a printout. Behind her, the lead flight attendant, a man named Greg with silver hair and kind eyes, followed closely, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell," Greg said, his voice low and professional. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "There's been a misunderstanding." Jennifer said nothing. She stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow her whole. Marcus didn't respond. He just waited. Greg cleared his throat. "We've confirmed your seat, and I want to personally assure you that this won't happen again. If there's anything we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable." "Who owns this airline?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. Greg blinked. "I'm sorry? Who owns this airline?" Jennifer's eyes flicked up, just for a second, and Marcus saw the exact moment the realization hit her. Her face went from pale to gray, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Greg hesitated. "Caldwell Enterprises, sir." The silence that followed was louder than the engines. Marcus let it stretch, let it fill the cabin like smoke, until everyone within earshot had processed what that meant. The man they'd just humiliated, the man they'd treated like an intruder in his own seat, owned the plane they were standing on. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked Jennifer dead in the eye. "Next time," he said softly, "maybe don't assume." Then he sat back, pulled out his laptop, and got to work. This is where the story really begins. Because what you just witnessed wasn't just about a flight attendant's mistake. It was about a man who spent his entire life being told he didn't belong, and then bought the whole damn sky to prove them wrong. Stay with me, because what comes next will show you exactly how he got here. Marcus Caldwell wasn't always a billionaire. Hell, there was a time when he wasn't even sure he'd make it to college. He grew up in South Memphis, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered more than they stayed on and gunshots were a lullaby you learned to sleep through. His mother, Diane, worked 3 jobs, one of them cleaning the interiors of private jets at a hangar outside the city. She'd come home smelling like disinfectant and exhaustion. Her hands cracked from chemicals, her back bent from hours of scrubbing leather seats that cost more than their rent. Marcus was 10 the first time she took him to work with her. It was a Saturday, and she couldn't afford a babysitter. He remembered walking into that hangar and seeing the planes lined up like sleeping giants, their wings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He'd never seen anything so beautiful. "Don't touch nothing," Diane had warned, her voice sharp but not unkind. These people don't play about their stuff, but Marcus couldn't help it. He walked up to one of the jets, a sleek Gulfstream with polished chrome and windows so clean they looked like mirrors, and pressed his palm flat against the fuselage. The metal was cool, smooth, perfect. He closed his eyes and imagined what it would feel like to sit inside, to fly above the clouds, to be the kind of person who never had to worry about whether the lights would stay on. "Boy, what did I just say?" Diane's voice snapped him back to reality. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him away, but not before he saw the way she looked at the plane too, like it was something beautiful and cruel all at once. That night, on the bus ride home, Marcus asked her, "Mama, who flies in those planes?" Diane stared out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "Rich folks, CEOs, people who got money to burn. You think I could be one of them?" She turned to look at him, and for a moment, he thought she might laugh. But instead, she cupped his face in her rough, calloused hands and said, "Baby, you can be whatever you want, but you gotta work 10 times harder than anybody else to get there. You hear me? 10 times. He nodded, even though he didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet. By the time Marcus was 15, he understood perfectly. He was a straight-A student at Booker T. Washington High, the kind of kid teachers called promising and classmates called bougie, because he actually cared about his grades. He worked part-time at a grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries, saving every dollar he could for a future he couldn't quite see but knew he wanted. His best friend, Darius, thought he was crazy. "Man, you act like you tryna be white or something," Darius would say, laughing as they shot hoops in the park. "Ain't nobody from the bluff getting out. You know that, right?" Marcus didn't argue. He just kept working, kept studying, kept dreaming. When he was 16, he applied for a summer internship at FedEx headquarters downtown. It was a long shot. Most of the kids who got those spots came from private schools in East Memphis. Kids with parents who knew people. Kids who didn't have to work grocery store shifts to afford new shoes. But Marcus wrote an essay about his mother, about watching her clean planes and realizing that the distance between the people who cleaned them and the people who owned them wasn't about talent or intelligence. It was about access. He got the internship. It wasn't glamorous. He spent most of his days making copies, filing paperwork, fetching coffee for executives who barely looked at him. But he watched. He listened. He learned how deals were made, how power was brokered, how the people at the top of the ladder had built their empires not just with money, but with strategy, patience, and an almost ruthless focus. One afternoon, he overheard two executives talking in the break room. One of them, a man named Richard Lawson, was complaining about a logistics issue with their air fleet. "We're hemorrhaging money on these leases," he said, shaking his head. "If we owned the planes outright, we'd save millions." Marcus filed that away. He didn't know how yet, but he knew it mattered. That night, he went to the public library and checked out every book he could find on aviation, logistics, and business acquisition. He read until his eyes burned, until the words blurred together, until the librarian had to kick him out at closing time. Darius was right about one thing. Nobody from the bluff was supposed to get out. But Marcus wasn't nobody. He got into Morehouse College on a full scholarship, majoring in business administration with a minor in aerospace engineering. His mother cried when she got the acceptance letter, clutching it to her chest like it was made of gold. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You really did it." But Marcus knew the work was just beginning. College was a different battlefield, one where he was surrounded by kids who'd grown up with safety nets and second chances, kids who could afford to fail because their parents would catch them. Marcus didn't have that luxury. He couldn't afford to stumble, couldn't afford to be anything less than excellent. So he became excellent. He graduated summa cum laude, landed a job at a private equity firm in Atlanta, and spent the next 5 years learning everything he could about mergers, acquisitions, and how to turn struggling companies into gold mines. By the time he was 30, he'd saved enough to make his first big move, buying a small regional airline that was bleeding money and on the verge of bankruptcy. Everyone thought he was insane. His colleagues at the firm laughed. His mentor told him he was throwing his career away. But Marcus saw something they didn't. He saw the same thing he'd seen in that hangar when he was 10 years old: potential. He renamed the company Caldwell Enterprises, restructured the routes, renegotiated contracts, and turned a profit within 2 years. Then he bought another airline, then another. Then he started acquiring the planes themselves, the Gulfstreams, the Bombardiers, the jets his mother used to clean. And now, at 42, he owned the sky. But success didn't erase the memory of being 10 years old and told not to touch. It didn't erase the grocery store shifts, the skeptical looks, the people who saw him and assumed he didn't belong. It just made him more determined to prove them wrong. If you're still with me, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Because Marcus's story is just getting started. And trust me, you're going to want to see what he does next. London was cold and gray when Marcus landed at Heathrow. The kind of weather that seeped into your bones and made you wonder why anyone chose to live there. He stepped off the plane, his plane, a custom Bombardier Global 7500 with cream leather seats and a cabin that smelled like cedar and success, and was greeted by his assistant, Priya, who handed him a tablet without missing a beat. "Your 10 o'clock with Sterling Aviation is confirmed," she said, scrolling through the schedule. "They're expecting you at their headquarters in Canary Wharf. Traffic's light, so we should make it with time to spare." Marcus nodded, scanning the brief on the screen. Sterling Aviation was a European giant, one of the oldest and most respected names in the industry. They were also drowning in debt, hemorrhaging market share, and desperate for a lifeline. That's where Marcus came in. The deal was simple. Caldwell Enterprises would acquire 60% of Sterling's assets, inject $2 billion in capital, and restructure their operations. In exchange, Marcus would become the majority stakeholder and de facto CEO of a company that, until recently, wouldn't have let him clean their planes, let alone run them. The irony wasn't lost on him. The car ride into the city was quiet. Marcus stared out the window. watching the sprawl of suburbs give way to the steel and glass towers of Canary Wharf. He thought about his mother, who'd passed away 3 years ago from complications of diabetes. She never got to see this moment, never got to see her son walk into a boardroom and rewrite the rules. But he carried her with him anyway. In every meeting, every negotiation, every decision that required him to be twice as sharp and 3 times as prepared as anyone else in the room. The Sterling Aviation headquarters was everything you'd expect from old money. Marble floors, oil paintings of dead white men in suits, a receptionist who looked at Marcus like he might be lost. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. She glanced at her screen, then back at him, her expression skeptical. "And you are?" "Marcus Caldwell." Her eyes widened, just slightly, and she straightened in her chair. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell. Please, have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." He didn't sit. He stood in the lobby, hands in his pockets, and studied the portraits on the walls. Generations of Sterlings stared back at him, men who'd built an empire on the backs of colonialism, war contracts, and government subsidies. Men who'd never had to prove they belonged, because their names alone were proof enough. Marcus smiled to himself. Times change. The boardroom was on the 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Thames. Around the table sat 8 people. Sterling's CFO, their lead counsel, 2 investment bankers, and the company's co-founders' brothers named Edward and Philip Sterling, both in their 60s, both wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus walked in, shook hands, and took his seat at the head of the table. It wasn't his table. Not yet. But the way he sat, the way he opened his briefcase and laid out his notes with calm precision, made it clear he wasn't here to ask permission. Edward Sterling cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, we appreciate you making the trip. I trust you've reviewed the terms of the proposed acquisition?" "I have," Marcus said. "I've made some adjustments." The room went still. Philip leaned forward, frowning. "Adjustments?" Marcus slid a revised contract across the table. "Your initial offer valued the company at $6.5 billion. Based on my team's analysis, that's inflated by about 30%. Your debt-to-equity ratio is unsustainable, your fleet is aging, and your customer retention rates have dropped 18% in the last 2 years. So here's my offer. $4.3 billion, with full operational control transferred to Caldwell Enterprises upon closing." Edward's face flushed red. "That's absurd. You're trying to lowball us." "I'm trying to save your company," Marcus corrected, his voice even. "You came to me, remember? You don't have a lot of options here. You can take my offer, restructure, and walk away with enough capital to retire comfortably. Or you can hold out for a better deal that isn't coming, and in 6 months, Sterling Aviation will be in receivership." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Philip exchanged a glance with his brother, then looked back at Marcus. "And if we agree to this, you'd be the majority owner." "The CEO." "That's correct. A black CEO running Sterling Aviation." Philip said it slowly, like he was testing how the words tasted. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. "Is that a problem?" "It's unprecedented. So was electricity. So was the internet. So was everything worth doing." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but his eyes sharp as knives. "Gentlemen, I'm not here to make history. I'm here to make money. If you can't separate the two, that's your issue, not mine." Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We'll need time to discuss this internally." "You have 48 hours, Marcus said. "After that, the offer expires." As Marcus walked out of the building, Priya fell into step beside him. "That was brutal," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "That was business," Marcus replied. "They'll take the deal. They don't have a choice." "And if they don't?" He smiled, cold and certain. Then I'll buy their biggest competitor and run them into the ground." Priya laughed. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Too late. "You work for me." They climbed into the car, and as it pulled away from the curb, Marcus stared out the window at the city rushing past. He thought about Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant who'd looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. He thought about every teacher who'd said he'd never make it, every banker who denied him a loan, every boardroom that had underestimated him. And he smiled. Because they were all wrong. This is the man who refused to stay in his lane. And if you think this story is just about business, you're missing the point. Follow along, because the next chapter is where Marcus's past comes crashing back, and it's going to cost him everything. Marcus didn't sleep well in London. The hotel was 5-star, the bed was memory foam perfection, and the room had a view of the city that most people would kill for. But none of that mattered when your mind refused to shut off. He lay awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling, thinking about Darius Moore, his best friend, his brother, the kid who used to laugh at Marcus's dreams and then defend him when anyone else tried to do the same. Darius, who'd been shot and killed outside a corner store in South Memphis when they were both 23 years old. A stupid argument over a basketball game. A gun that shouldn't have been there. A life snuffed out before it even really started. Marcus hadn't been there when it happened. He'd been in Atlanta, grinding at his first job, working 80-hour weeks to prove he belonged. He got the call from Darius's mom, Miss Lorraine, and he remembered how the phone had slipped from his hand, how he'd stood frozen in his apartment, unable to process the words she was saying. He flew home for the funeral. The church was packed, standing room only, filled with people who loved Darius and people who barely knew him but showed up because that's what you did. Marcus sat in the front row, numb, staring at the closed casket draped in white lilies, and all he could think was, I should have been there, not to stop it. He wasn't naive enough to think he could have changed anything, but to be there, to say goodbye, to tell Darius that he was right. Nobody from the bluff was supposed to get out. But Marcus had anyway, and he'd spent every day since then carrying the weight of that escape like a stone in his chest. The guilt never left. It became part of him, woven into the fabric of his ambition. Every deal he closed, every company he acquired, every time he walked into a room and took control, it was for Darius. For the boy who never got the chance to dream past the bluff. For the friend who believed in him even when Marcus didn't believe in himself. And it was for his mother, who worked herself to death so Marcus could have a shot at something better. But success was a lonely companion. The higher Marcus climbed, the fewer people understood him. His old friends from Memphis had stopped calling years ago, their lives diverging in ways that made small talk feel like speaking different languages. The people in his new world, the investors, the executives, the billionaires he rubbed elbows with at charity galas, saw him as either an anomaly or a threat. He was too black for some rooms, too rich for others, and never quite enough of either to feel like he belonged anywhere. Priya once asked him why he never took time off, why he never slowed down. Because the moment I stop, he'd said, I remember everything I've lost. The next morning, Marcus was back in business mode. He met with Sterling's legal team, hammered out the final details of the acquisition, and by noon, the deal was signed. Edward and Philip Sterling looked like men at a funeral, their own. But they shook Marcus's hand, took their checks, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Marcus stood alone in the empty room, staring out at the Thames, and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just the quiet hum of another victory that didn't fill the hollow space inside him. His phone buzzed. A text from Zara, his daughter. Daddy, when are you coming home? I miss you. He smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days, and typed back, soon, baby girl. I promise. Zara was his anchor. The one person in his life who saw him not as Marcus Caldwell, billionaire, CEO, but just as Dad. She lived with her mother, Simone, in Atlanta. Marcus and Simone had never married. They tried briefly, but the relationship had imploded under the weight of his ambition and her resentment of it. Still, they co-parented well enough. Simone hated him sometimes, but she never let Zara see it. Marcus loved his daughter with a ferocity that terrified him, because he knew, deep down, that the world would try to do to her what it had tried to do to him. Make her feel small. Make her feel like she had to prove she deserved to exist in spaces that were supposedly not for her. And he'd be damned if he let that happen. That evening, Marcus flew back to Atlanta. The flight was smooth, uneventful, and for once, he didn't work. He just sat in his seat, always and stared out the window at the clouds below, thinking about the flight attendant who tried to humiliate him. He'd thought about firing her. Hell, he'd thought about making an example of her, about ensuring that every employee at Caldwell Enterprises knew that racism, subtle or blatant, would not be tolerated. But then he thought about Darius, about Miss Lorraine, about his mother, and he realized revenge wasn't the point. The point was to build something so undeniable that people like Jennifer Walsh couldn't ignore it. The point was to take up space, not because he was angry, but because he refused to be erased. So instead of firing her, Marcus sent a company-wide memo. It was simple, direct, and left no room for interpretation. At Caldwell Enterprises, we don't just talk about inclusion, we live it. Every passenger, regardless of race, class, or background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. If you can't do that, you don't belong here. He attached a memo to a mandatory diversity training program for all staff. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. When Marcus landed in Atlanta, Zara was waiting for him at the gate, bouncing on her toes, her braids swinging as she ran into his arms. "Daddy!" She squealed, wrapping her small arms around his neck. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in weeks, the hollow space inside him felt a little less empty. "I missed you, Z," he whispered. "I missed you more," she said, pulling back to look at him with her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin. "Did you buy another plane?" He laughed. "Not a plane. A whole airline." Her eyes went wide. "Can we fly on it?" "Whenever you want, baby girl." "Whenever you want." Marcus built an empire so his daughter wouldn't have to fight the same battles he did. But empires come with enemies. And the biggest one is about to show up at his door. Comment below. What would you do if you were in Marcus's shoes? 3 months after the Sterling acquisition, Marcus received a phone call that made his blood run cold. It was from his CFO, Angela Reeves, a sharp-as-hell finance guru who'd been with Caldwell Enterprises since the beginning. Her voice was tight, clipped, the way it always got when she was delivering bad news. "We have a problem," she said. Marcus was in his home office in Buckhead, reviewing quarterly projections, and he set down his pen slowly. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that could tank the company if we don't handle it right." He closed his laptop. "I'm listening." Angela took a breath. "Do you remember Leonard Grayson?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Of course I remember Leonard. Leonard Grayson. His first business partner. The man who'd been with him from the start, who'd helped him secure the funding for their first airline acquisition, who'd stood beside him in boardrooms when everyone else doubted them. Leonard, who'd been more than a partner. He'd been a friend. Or so Marcus had thought. "What about him?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously calm. "He's filed a lawsuit," Angela said, "claiming he's owed 40% of Caldwell Enterprises. Says you froze him out of the Sterling deal and breached the original partnership agreement." The words hit Marcus like a freight train. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Then the anger came, hot and sharp, flooding his chest. "That's bullshit," he said finally. "Leonard left the company. He signed the buyout agreement 5 years ago. He walked away with $50 million and a handshake. I know, Angela said. But he's claiming the agreement was signed under duress. He's got lawyers, Marcus. Good ones. And they're making noise. Marcus stood up, pacing the length of his office, his mind racing. Leonard Grayson. The same Leonard who'd bailed on the company when things got hard, who'd lost his nerve after their second acquisition nearly went under, who'd taken the payout and run. And now he was back, trying to take credit for the empire Marcus had built with his own blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. How much is he asking for? Marcus asked. $2.7 billion. Plus a seat on the board. Marcus laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. Of course he is. The lawsuit made headlines within days. Caldwell Enterprises faces legal battle over ownership claims. Read the Wall Street Journal. Billionaire CEO accused of freezing out co-founder, said Bloomberg. The media loved it. A black-on-black business dispute. The kind of story that let them pretend race wasn't a factor while making it the subtext of every paragraph. Marcus watched the coverage with clenched fists and a racing heart. He'd spent his entire life building something that couldn't be taken from him, something that couldn't be diminished or dismissed. And now Leonard was trying to tear it apart. But worse than the lawsuit, worse than the headlines, was the betrayal. Because Leonard had been there. He'd seen what Marcus had sacrificed, had watched him pour every ounce of himself into Caldwell Enterprises. And now he was standing in a courtroom, lying through his teeth, trying to claim a piece of something he'd abandoned. Marcus called him. Once. Leonard didn't pick up. So Marcus left a voicemail, his voice low and steady, each word sharpened to a point. You want to do this, Leonard? Fine. But don't forget, I know where the bodies are buried. And if you push me, I'll bury you with them. He hung up, deleted the message from his own phone. And then he got to work. Marcus hired the best legal team money could buy 3 sharks from a white shoe firm in Manhattan who specialized in corporate litigation. They tore through the buyout agreement, compiled evidence of Leonard's voluntary departure, and built a case so airtight it could survive a hurricane. But Marcus didn't just fight the lawsuit in court. He fought it in the press, too. He gave interviews, carefully worded and strategically placed, where he talked about the sacrifices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the nights he'd gone without sleep to keep the company afloat while Leonard was cashing checks and living large in Malibu. I don't blame Leonard for leaving, Marcus said in one interview, his tone measured but unmistakably pointed. Building a business is hard. Not everyone has the stomach for it. But to come back now, after the heavy lifting is done, and claim he's owed a piece of what we built? That's not partnership. That's opportunism. The interview went viral. Social media exploded. Some people sided with Marcus, calling Leonard a snake and a traitor. Others accused Marcus of being ruthless, of cutting Leonard out to hoard the glory for himself. Marcus didn't care. He'd stopped caring what people thought of him a long time ago. The trial lasted 3 months. Leonard's lawyers argued that the buyout agreement had been coerced, that Marcus had manipulated Leonard into signing away his stake by threatening to tank the company if he didn't. They brought in financial experts, former employees, even a business psychologist who testified about power dynamics and psychological duress. Marcus's team dismantled them piece by piece. They showed emails where Leonard had explicitly stated his desire to leave the company. They presented financial records proving that the buyout had been generous, far more than Leonard's stake was worth at the time. They even called Leonard's ex-wife to the stand, who testified that Leonard had bragged about getting out while the getting was good, and had used the $50 million to fund a lifestyle of yachts, sports cars, and bad investments. By the time closing arguments rolled around, Leonard looked like a man who'd walked into a lion's den expecting a house cat. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous. Marcus Caldwell owed Leonard Grayson nothing. Marcus didn't celebrate. He sat in the courtroom, hands folded in his lap, and watched Leonard's face crumble. For a moment, he felt something almost like pity. Almost. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out without looking back. That night, Marcus sat in his office with a glass of bourbon and a mountain of paperwork. The lawsuit was over, but the damage lingered. Investors were skittish, employees were rattled, and Marcus was exhausted, not just from the trial, but from the constant, relentless pressure of having to prove, over and over again, that he deserved to be here. His phone buzzed. A text from Zara. "Daddy, are you okay? Mommy said you won something." He smiled, a small, weary smile, and typed back, "Yeah, baby girl. I won. I'm okay." But as he stared at the words on the screen, he wasn't sure if they were true. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, you know how deep that wound cuts. Subscribe to keep following Marcus's journey, because what happens next will test him in ways even he didn't see coming. Her name was Dr. Naomi Grant, and she walked into Marcus's life on a Tuesday afternoon in October, carrying a leather portfolio and an expression that suggested she didn't have time for nonsense. They met at a philanthropy summit in New York, one of those events where billionaires pretended to care about social justice while sipping champagne that cost more than most people's rent. Marcus hated these things, but they were part of the job. Networking, image management, playing the game. Naomi wasn't playing. She was a keynote speaker, a renowned sociologist and author who'd written 3 best-selling books on systemic inequality and economic mobility. Marcus had read one of them, The Myth of Meritocracy, and it had pissed him off and inspired him in equal measure. She had a way of cutting through the bullshit, of naming the things everyone else danced around, and she didn't care if it made people uncomfortable. During her talk, she said something that made Marcus sit up straighter in his chair. Success is not a reward for hard work. It's a privilege afforded to those who have access, opportunity, and let's be honest, the right skin color. And for the few who manage to break through despite every barrier, we call them exceptions, so we don't have to examine the rule. The room went silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus nodded slowly because she just articulated something he'd felt his entire life, but never quite knew how to say. After the talk, he found her in the hallway, surrounded by admirers and critics alike. He waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with his hand extended. "Dr. Grant." Marcus Caldwell. She looked at him, really looked at him, in a way that made him feel both exposed and seen. Her handshake was firm, confident. "I know who you are," she said. "You're the exception everyone loves to talk about." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Is that a compliment or an accusation? Both. She tilted her head, studying him. "You've done something remarkable. Built an empire from nothing. But people use your story to pretend the system works, when really, you just figured out how to survive it." Marcus felt something shift in his chest recognition. Maybe. Or relief. "You're the first person who said that to me," he admitted. "That's because most people need you to be a fairy tale," Naomi said. "It's easier than admitting the deck is stacked." They talked for 2 hours. About systemic barriers, about the myth of bootstraps, about the exhaustion of being a symbol instead of just a person. She challenged him, pushed back when he got too comfortable, refused to let him hide behind corporate speak or humble bragging. And Marcus, for the first time in years, felt like he could breathe. They started meeting regularly after that. Coffee in Atlanta, dinner in D.C., late-night phone calls where they debated everything from economic policy to the best way to make cornbread. Naomi didn't treat him like Marcus Caldwell, billionaire CEO. She treated him like Marcus, the kid from South Memphis who still carried his mother's voice in his head. "You know what your problem is?" she said one night, over takeout in his office. "You think you have to save everyone. Your employees, your community, even the people who betrayed you. But you can't pour from an empty cup, Marcus. He set down his fork. What am I supposed to do? Just stop caring. No, stop trying to prove you deserve to be here. You've already proven it. 1,000 times over. Her words hit him harder than any lawsuit, any insult, any doubt he'd ever carried. Because she was right. He'd spent his entire life justifying his existence to people who would never see him as anything more than an anomaly. And he was tired. So damn tired. Naomi reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. You're allowed to rest, you know? You're allowed to be human. Marcus looked at her. This brilliant, fierce, complicated woman who'd somehow seen through every wall he built and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. They became inseparable. Naomi challenged him in ways no one else did, called him out when he was being too hard on himself or too soft on people who didn't deserve his grace. She sat in on board meetings, offered strategic advice, and wasn't afraid to tell him when his ego was getting in the way. But she also saw the parts of him he kept hidden. The guilt over Darius, the grief over his mother, the loneliness that came with being the only black CEO in rooms full of people who looked at him like an experiment. You carry so much, she said one night, lying beside him in the dark. But you don't have to carry it alone. Marcus turned to face her, his voice raw. I don't know how not to. Then let me teach you. And slowly, painfully, he did. He learned to delegate, to trust his team, to accept that he didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. He learned to say no to deals that didn't align with his values, even if they were profitable. He learned to prioritize Zara, to show up for her recitals and parent-teacher conferences instead of sending assistance or apologies. He learned to live, not just survive. But intimacy is a double-edged sword. The closer Naomi got, the more she saw not just his strengths, but his flaws. The way he shut down when things got too emotional. The way he worked himself into the ground to avoid feeling anything. The way he used success as a shield, a way to prove to the world that he was more than the sum of its low expectations. You're still running, she said one morning, after he'd spent another all-nighter reviewing contracts. You're just running uphill now. I'm not running, he snapped. I'm building. For who? For Zara? For your mother? For Darius? She crossed her arms. Or are you building a monument to your own pain so you never have to deal with it? The accusation stung because it was true. Marcus had spent 20 years turning trauma into fuel, grief into ambition, and now he didn't know who he'd be without it. I don't know how to stop, he admitted quietly. Naomi's expression softened. Then maybe it's time to figure it out. Because this version of success? It's killing you. That conversation haunted Marcus for weeks. He thought about it during board meetings, during flights, during the rare moments when he wasn't drowning in work. He thought about his mother, who'd worked herself to death so he could have a better life. He thought about Darius, who never got the chance to figure out who he could be beyond the bluff. And he thought about Zara, who was growing up watching her father build empires, but never really being present for her. One Saturday, Marcus cleared his schedule, something he almost never did, and took Zara to the Georgia Aquarium. They watched the beluga whales swim lazy circles, ate overpriced pizza, and talked about nothing and everything. Daddy, Zara said, tugging on his sleeve as they stood in front of the dolphin tank. Are you happy? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean, baby girl? You always look tired, she said, her voice small and serious. Like you're thinking about work even when you're not working. Marcus knelt down so they were eye level, his heart breaking a little. I'm happy when I'm with you, he said, and he meant it. But what about when you're not with me? He didn't have an answer. So he pulled her into a hug, held her tight, and promised himself he'd figure it out. That night, Marcus called Naomi. You were right, he said. I've been running. But I don't want to anymore. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, so what are you going to do? I don't know yet. but I want to find out. With you. Naomi laughed, soft and warm. Took you long enough. Marcus built an empire, but he's finally learning that success without connection is just loneliness with a better view. If this story is resonating with you, drop a comment, because the next chapter is where everything Marcus has built is about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. It started with a single news alert at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Caldwell Enterprises plane crash in Nevada, all passengers presumed dead. Marcus was in the shower when his phone started blowing up. Calls from Angela, from Priya, from board members, from news outlets. He grabbed a towel, water still dripping down his back, and answered Angela's call with shaking hands. "Talk to me," he said, his voice tight. Flight 822, a charter jet en route to Vegas for a corporate retreat. It went down 20 minutes ago in the desert outside Henderson. Search and rescue is on the scene. But ... quote. She paused, her voice cracking. "Marcus, there were 18 people on that plane. Employees. Our employees." The phone slipped from his hand. For a moment, Marcus couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. 18 people. 18 families. 18 lives that had been entrusted to him, to his company, to the planes he'd promised were safe. Gone. He picked up the phone, his voice barely a whisper. What happened? They don't know yet. Could be mechanical failure, pilot error, weather. It's too early to tell. But Marcus, the FAA, is launching an investigation, and the media is already calling it the Caldwell disaster. He closed his eyes, felt the room tilt beneath him. "I'm on my way." The next 72 hours were a blur. Marcus flew to Nevada, met with investigators, spoke with families, and held press conferences where he stood in front of cameras and microphones and tried to find words that could make sense of the senseless. "Our hearts are with the families of the victims," he said, his voice steady even though his hands were trembling. "We are cooperating fully with the investigation, and we will not rest until we understand what happened and ensure it never happens again." But the damage was done. The stock price plummeted. Investors panicked. Lawsuits started piling up, wrongful death claims, negligence suits, demands for compensation that could run into the hundreds of millions. And the media circus was relentless. Every news outlet ran the story with variations of the same headline. "Black billionaire's airline under fire after deadly crash." Op-eds questioned whether Marcus was qualified to run an aviation company. Talking heads debated whether Caldwell Enterprises had cut corners, prioritized profits over safety, whether Marcus's rapid expansion had been reckless. The subtext was always the same. He got too big too fast. He didn't belong here in the first place. Marcus read every article, watched every segment, let the criticism sink into his bones like poison, because part of him wondered if they were right. If he'd been so focused on building, on proving himself, on beating the system, that he'd missed something crucial. If 18 people were dead because of his ambition. The preliminary investigation revealed that the crash was caused by a catastrophic engine failure, a defect in a part manufactured by a third-party supplier. It wasn't Caldwell Enterprises' fault, technically, but Marcus knew that didn't matter. He was the CEO. The buck stopped with him. He called an emergency board meeting. 15 people sat around the conference table, all of them looking at Marcus like he was a grenade with the pin pulled. "We need to make a decision," Angela said, her tone grim. "We can fight these lawsuits, argue that we're not liable since the defect was in the supplier's equipment. Or we can settle, offer compensation to the families, and try to move forward." "How much are we talking?" one of the board members asked. "Conservatively, $400 million. Maybe more." The room erupted. People argued, calculated, strategized. But Marcus just sat there, silent, staring at the table. Finally, he spoke. "We settle, all of it. Every family gets full compensation, no caps, no fine print. And we establish a $50 million fund for their children's education and long-term care. The room went quiet. Marcus, Angela said carefully, that's going to gut our reserves. We'll have to pull back on expansion. Delay the European deals. I don't care. His voice was flat, final. 18 people are dead. Their families deserve more than a legal fight. They deserve justice. And if that means Caldwell Enterprises takes a hit, so be it. One of the board members, a venture capitalist named Derek, leaned forward. With all due respect, this could bankrupt the company. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Marcus looked at him, his gaze cold and unwavering. My emotions? These were my employees, people who trusted me, who got on that plane because they believed in this company. And you want me to treat their deaths like a line item on a balance sheet? Derek didn't answer. If anyone here thinks I'm making the wrong call, Marcus continued, his voice rising, you can walk. Right now. Because I didn't build this company to play it safe or to protect shareholders at the expense of doing what's right. I built it to be better. And if you can't handle that, you don't belong here. No one moved. Marcus stood. We settle. That's final. Meeting adjourned. The settlements were announced 2 weeks later. The media response was mixed. Some praised Marcus for taking responsibility. Others accused him of throwing money at the problem to avoid accountability. But the families, at least, seemed grateful. One of them, a woman named Karen, whose husband had died in the crash, sent Marcus a handwritten letter. Thank you for seeing us as people, not problems. My husband believed in you. And now I understand why. Marcus read the letter alone in his office, late at night, and cried for the first time since the crash. Not because of the money, or the lawsuits, or the press, but because he realized something he'd been running from his entire life. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much he built, he couldn't control everything. He couldn't save everyone. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, tragedy still found you. Naomi found him that night, slumped in his chair, the letter still in his hand. She didn't say anything. She just sat beside him, pulled his head onto her shoulder, and let him fall apart. I don't know if I can do this anymore, he whispered. You don't have to do it alone, she said. That's what I'm here for. And for the first time in his life, Marcus let himself believe her. When everything you've built hangs by a thread, you learn who you really are. Follow this story to see if Marcus can rise from the ashes, or if the weight of it all finally breaks him. The months following the crash were the darkest of Marcus's life. Darker than the poverty of his childhood. Darker than the grief of losing Darius and his mother. Darker than the betrayal with Leonard. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about 18 families, a company on the brink, and a legacy he'd spent 2 decades building that could crumble in an instant. Caldwell Enterprises stock dropped 38% in the first month. 2 major investors pulled out. 3 board members resigned. Marcus spent his days in damage control meetings and his nights staring at spreadsheets that showed the company hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. We need to make cuts, Angela told him during one particularly brutal financial review. Staff reductions, route cancellations, maybe even selling off some of the smaller acquisitions. Marcus shook his head. We're not laying people off. Not now. Marcus, we don't have a choice. If we don't stop the bleeding. I said no. His voice was sharp, final. These people didn't cause this crisis. I'm not making them pay for it. Angela sighed, rubbing her temples. Then what do you want to do? Because hope isn't a strategy. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. I'll figure it out. But for the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't sure he could. Naomi became his anchor. She moved into his place in Buckhead, not because he asked, but because she knew he needed someone to make sure he ate, slept, and didn't work himself into an early grave. She sat with him through late-night strategy sessions, challenged his decisions when they were driven by guilt instead of logic, and reminded him constantly, stubbornly, that he was human. "You can't save the company by destroying yourself," she said one night, physically removing his laptop from his hands at 2 a.m. "You need rest. I need solutions," he countered. "You need perspective." She sat beside him, her voice softer now. "Marcus, you spent your whole life proving you're enough. But you don't have to prove it to me. You don't have to prove it to your employees. And you sure as hell don't have to prove it to the people who want to see you fail." He looked at her, this woman who'd somehow become essential to his survival, and felt something crack open in his chest. "What if I can't fix this?" "Then we'll figure it out together. But you don't get to give up." Not yet. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Zara. Marcus had been spending more time with her, partly because Naomi insisted, and partly because he needed the reminder that there were things in life more important than business. One Saturday, they were building a Lego set together, some elaborate castle that required more patience than Marcus had left, when Zara looked up at him with those big, serious eyes. "Daddy, why are people being mean to you on TV?" Marcus froze. He'd tried to shield her from the media coverage, but kids heard things, saw things. Because sometimes when something bad happens, people look for someone to blame, he said carefully. "But it wasn't your fault. No, baby girl, it wasn't." "Then why do you look so sad all the time?" Marcus didn't have an answer for that. So he pulled her into his lap, held her close, and let himself feel the weight of everything he was carrying. "You know what, Z? You're right. It wasn't my fault. And I think maybe I forgot that." She hugged him tighter. "You're the best daddy in the world. Don't let anyone make you forget." And just like that, something shifted. Not fixed, nothing was fixed, but shifted. Because Zara was right. He'd been so consumed by guilt, by the need to prove he wasn't responsible, that he'd lost sight of the truth. Accidents happen. Even in the best-run companies, even with the most stringent safety protocols, sometimes things go wrong. It didn't mean he wasn't devastated. It didn't mean he wouldn't do everything in his power to prevent it from happening again. But it meant he could stop drowning in guilt long enough to actually lead. Marcus called an all-hands meeting the following Monday. Every employee at Caldwell Enterprises, from pilots to mechanics to administrative staff, gathered in the main hangar in Atlanta. News crews were there too, cameras rolling, waiting to see if this was a resignation speech or a rally cry. Marcus stood on a small platform, no notes, no teleprompter. Just him and a microphone, and a company full of people who needed to know they still had a leader. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he began. "The last few months have been hell. We lost 18 colleagues, 18 friends, in a tragedy that should never have happened. We faced lawsuits, investigations, media scrutiny, and financial pressure that would have sunk most companies." He paused, looked out at the sea of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all exhausted. "But we're still here. And as long as I'm breathing, Caldwell Enterprises will be here too. Not because we're perfect. Not because we haven't made mistakes. But because we refuse to let tragedy define us." The room was silent. "I know some of you are scared. Scared for your jobs. Scared for the future of this company. I get it. Hell, I'm scared too. But here's what I know. We are not our worst moment. We are how we respond to it. And we're going to respond by doing what we've always done, working harder, flying safer, and proving that black excellence isn't just a slogan. It's a standard." A few people started clapping. Then more. Then the whole hangar erupted in applause, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The recovery was slow, painstaking. Marcus personally oversaw a top-to-bottom safety audit of every plane in the fleet. He hired the best aviation engineers in the world to implement new protocols. He met with every supplier, every contractor, every partner, and made it clear. Cutting corners was no longer an option. He also did something he'd never done before. He stepped back. He promoted Angela to Q, giving her operational control so he could focus on strategy and vision. He brought in Naomi as a consultant on corporate culture, tasking her with ensuring that Caldwell Enterprises wasn't just profitable, but ethical. And slowly, painfully, the company stabilized. The stock price crept back up. New investors emerged. Routes reopened. The lawsuits settled. The media moved on to the next scandal. But Marcus never forgot. He kept photos of the 18 victims in his office, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of the weight of leadership, of the cost of ambition, of the fact that no empire, no matter how successful, was worth losing your humanity for. 1 year after the crash, Marcus stood at a memorial service in Henderson, Nevada, surrounded by the families of the victims. He didn't give a speech. He just stood there, silent and present, and let them say what they needed to say. Afterward, Karen, the woman who'd sent him the letter, approached him. "Thank you for being here," she said. "A lot of CEOs would have sent a representative." "I'm not a lot of CEOs," Marcus replied. She smiled, sad but genuine. "No, you're not. Sometimes the hardest thing about success is learning to forgive yourself when things go wrong." If you're still with Marcus on this journey, comment below, because the final chapters are where he'll face his biggest test yet. 2 years after the crash, Caldwell Enterprises was thriving again. The European expansion was back on track. New routes had launched in Africa and Asia. The fleet had been modernized. Safety ratings were at an all-time high, and Marcus had become something he'd never expected, a symbol of resilience. But symbols are heavy, and Marcus was tired of carrying them. He sat in his office on a gray December afternoon, staring at an email from the Harvard Business School. They wanted him to give the commencement speech, to stand in front of hundreds of graduates, most of them white, most of them wealthy, most of them destined for corner offices and trust funds, and tell them how to succeed. "What do you think?" Naomi asked, reading over his shoulder. "I think it's ironic," Marcus said. "They want me to inspire the same people who'll grow up to be the investors who doubt me, the board members who question me, the journalists who write think pieces about whether I'm qualified. So saying no, I can't." He looked at her. "Because there's going to be at least one kid in that audience who looks like me, who came from nothing, who's terrified they don't belong. And if I don't show up, who will?" Naomi smiled. "Then you already know your answer." Marcus spent weeks writing the speech. He rewrote it a dozen times, trying to find the balance between inspiration and honesty, between hope and rage, between the man he'd become and the boy he used to be. The day of the speech, he flew to Boston with Naomi and Zara. Zara was 11 now, tall and sharp and curious about everything. She insisted on coming because, in her words, "I want to see Daddy be famous." They sat in the front row as Marcus took the stage. The crowd was huge, thousands of students, faculty, parents, all looking at him with varying degrees of expectation. Marcus adjusted the microphone and began. "I'm going to tell you something they don't teach in business school. Success is not a meritocracy. It's a rigged game. And if you're black, if you're poor, if you're a woman, if you're anything other than the default setting, the deck is stacked against you from the start." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the feel-good speech they were expecting. "I grew up in South Memphis. My mother cleaned the interiors of private jets for a living. I used to watch her come home exhausted, her hands raw, her back bent, and I'd think, one day, I'm going to own those planes. One day, I'm going to make sure she never has to do that again." He paused, letting the words settle. "She died before I could." And that's the thing about dreams. They're always racing against time, against circumstances, against a world that wants you to stay in your lane. But I didn't stay in my lane. I built Caldwell Enterprises from nothing. I became the first black CEO to own a major airline. I made billions. I checked every box society said I needed to check to prove I was worthy. And you know what I learned? The room was silent. It's never enough. Because no matter how much you build, how much you achieve, there will always be someone questioning whether you deserve it, whether you cut corners, whether you got lucky, whether you're the exception that proves the rule. Marcus looked out at the crowd, his voice steady but fierce. So here's my advice. Stop trying to prove you belong. You belong because you exist. Build your empire. Chase your dreams. But don't sacrifice your humanity on the altar of other people's expectations. Don't let success become a prison. And for God's sake, don't wait until tragedy strikes to ask yourself what really matters. He took a breath. Because here's the truth. I've built an empire. I've made more money than I'll ever spend. I've flown higher than my mother could have imagined. But the moments that matter most, they're not in boardrooms or on balance sheets. They're with my daughter, with the woman I love, with the people who see me not as Marcus Caldwell, billionaire CEO, but just as Marcus. So yes, work hard. Be excellent. Break every ceiling they try to put over your head. But remember, you are not your resume. You are not your net worth. You are a human being, worthy of rest, of love, of grace. He smiled, just slightly. And if that's not what Harvard Business School wanted you to hear today, well, tough. The audience erupted. Some people were cheering, some were crying, some were sitting in stunned silence. But Marcus didn't care, because he'd finally said what he'd been carrying for 20 years. Afterward, students mobbed him. They wanted selfies, advice, autographs. But one student, a young black woman with braids and determination in her eyes, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I'm from Detroit. First generation, full scholarship. And every day, I feel like I don't belong here." Marcus looked at her, saw himself at 20 years old, and felt something crack open in his chest. "You belong," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone, not your classmates, not your professors, not yourself, tell you otherwise. You hear me?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." He hugged her, this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, and whispered, "Go build your empire. And don't forget to live while you're doing it." On the flight home, Zara fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder. Naomi reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did good today," she said softly. "Did I?" Marcus wasn't sure. "I basically told a bunch of Harvard students that the system is broken. You told them the truth. That's more valuable." Marcus looked out the window at the clouds below, the sky stretching endless and blue. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "I've spent my whole life trying to get here, to this level of success. And now that I'm here, I realize it was never about the destination. It was about proving to myself that I could make it. And have you? Proven it?" He thought about Darius, about his mother, about the 18 people who died on Flight 822, about Zara, asleep and safe and loved, about Naomi, who'd seen every broken part of him and stayed anyway. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I have." Marcus Caldwell built an empire, but the real victory was learning to be human while doing it. If this story touched you, subscribe, because the final chapters will show you what he does with the empire now that he's finally free. Marcus Caldwell turned 50 on a quiet Sunday morning in May. No big party, no press release, no celebratory gala. Just him, Naomi, and Zara on the back porch of his house in Buckhead, eating pancakes and watching the sun climb over the trees. 50, Naomi mused, sipping her coffee. How does it feel to be old? "Watch it," Marcus said, smirking. "You're only 3 years behind me." Zara laughed, syrup on her chin. "You guys are both old." Marcus pulled her into a playful headlock, and for a moment, everything felt light, easy. Like maybe he'd finally figured out how to balance the weight of what he built with the joy of simply being alive. But 50 was also a reckoning, a checkpoint. The age where you started thinking less about what you were building and more about what you'd leave behind. A week after his birthday, Marcus made an announcement that shocked the business world. He was stepping down as CEO of Caldwell Enterprises. Not retiring, not selling, just stepping back. After 25 years of building this company, he said in a press conference, "I've realized that the best thing I can do for Caldwell Enterprises is to let someone else lead it into the future. Someone who isn't carrying the weight of proving a point. Someone who can focus on excellence without the burden of being a symbol." He announced that Angela Reeves, his CFO turned coup, would be taking over as CEO, a black woman who'd been with the company since day one, who knew the business inside and out, who'd earned the role not because of optics, but because she was the best person for the job. The media had a field day. Some called it a power move. Others questioned whether Marcus was being forced out. A few conspiracy theorists suggested he was sick or broke or secretly planning a political run. The truth was simpler. Marcus was tired. Tired of being the face of black excellence. Tired of every decision being scrutinized through the lens of race. Tired of carrying an empire on his back when what he really wanted was to spend more time with his daughter, to travel with Naomi, to figure out who Marcus Caldwell was when he wasn't performing for an audience. "Are you sure about this?" Naomi asked the night before the transition became official. They were lying in bed, the room dark except for the glow of the city through the window. Marcus stared at the ceiling, his hand resting on her stomach. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. "I built Caldwell Enterprises to prove I could, and I did. But now I want to build something else." "Like what?" He turned to look at her. "A life, a real one. Not just success, but meaning." Naomi smiled, leaned over and kissed him. "Then let's build it together." Marcus's post-CEO life didn't look like retirement. He was too restless, too driven, too convinced that he still had something to contribute. But instead of running a company, he poured his energy into something else. A foundation. The Diane Caldwell Foundation for Economic Mobility was launched 6 months after Marcus stepped down. Named after his mother, it focused on providing scholarships, mentorship, and seed capital to young black entrepreneurs from underserved communities. The goal wasn't charity, it was access. The kind of access Marcus had to fight for every step of the way. He personally mentored 20 entrepreneurs in the first year. Sat in their pitch meetings, introduced them to investors, shared the hard-earned lessons he'd learned from building Caldwell Enterprises. One of them, a 19-year-old kid from Baltimore named Jamal, reminded Marcus so much of himself it hurt. "Mr. Caldwell," Jamal said during one of their meetings, "why are you doing this? Like, really, you've already made it. What do you get out of helping people like me?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "You know what the loneliest thing in the world is, Jamal? Being the only one who makes it out. I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the rule. And that starts with making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight as hard as I did." Jamal nodded slowly. "So you're building a ladder." "Exactly. And then I'm going to set it on fire so no one can pull it up behind me." Zara was 15 now, whip-smart and opinionated, and already talking about going to Spelman or Howard. She wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, which made Marcus both proud and terrified, because he knew what it was like to fight systems designed to break you. And he didn't want that for his daughter. But he also knew he couldn't protect her from the world. All he could do was give her the tools to navigate it. One night, over dinner, Zara asked him, "Dad, do you think things are better now?" "Like, for black people?" Marcus set down his fork, thought carefully. "Better than when I was your age?" "Yes." "Better than they should be?" "No. Progress is real, Z, but it's slow, and it's fragile. Which is why your generation has to keep pushing." "Do you ever get tired of it? The pushing?" He smiled sadly. "Every single day." But then I think about your grandma, who never got to see me succeed. And I think about Doris, who never got the chance to try. And I realize I don't have the luxury of being tired. None of us do. Zara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You're a good dad. You know that, right? Marcus's throat tightened. I'm trying, baby girl. I'm trying. 5 years after stepping down, Marcus sat in his office, no longer the CEO suite at Caldwell Enterprises, but a smaller space at the foundation headquarters, and wrote a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone who'd ever doubted him, dismissed him, underestimated him. To whom it may concern, I am not an exception. I am not a fairy tale. I am not proof that the system works. I am a man who survived a system designed to break me, and I did it by refusing to accept the limits you tried to place on me. But survival is not success. Success is building something that outlasts you. Success is creating opportunities for people who look like you, who come from where you came from, who carry the same weight you carried. Asterisk, I've made my money. I've built my empire. And now I'm using it to tear down the gates I had to climb over. Because the goal was never just to get in. The goal was to make sure no one else has to fight as hard as I did. Asterisk. So to the young black kid reading this, wondering if you belong, you do. You always did. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. To the people who said I'd never make it, thank you. Your doubt was fuel. And to my mother, who I carry with me every single day, I hope I made you proud. Marcus Caldwell. He posted the letter on the foundation's website. It went viral within hours, shared millions of times, quoted in articles, turned into motivational posters and Instagram captions. But Marcus wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was on a plane with Naomi and Zara, flying to Memphis to break ground on a new community center in the Bluff, the neighborhood where he grew up, the place that tried to keep him small. As the plane descended, Marcus looked out the window at the city below, the streets he used to walk, the corners he used to stand on, the place that told him he'd never leave, and he smiled, because he didn't just leave. He came back, and he brought the ladder with him. Marcus Caldwell's story isn't just about building wealth. It's about building a legacy that lifts others. If this resonated with you, follow for more stories about people who refuse to accept the limits placed on them. The community center opened on a Saturday in September, 10 years after Marcus stepped down as CEO. It was a gleaming 3-story building with a tech lab, recording studio, basketball court, and library, everything the Bluff never had when Marcus was growing up. The dedication ceremony was packed. Former neighbors, childhood friends, people Marcus hadn't seen in decades. Miss Lorraine, Doris's mother, was there in the front row, older now but still sharp-eyed and proud. She'd been the first person Marcus called when the project was approved. "This is for Darius," he'd told her. For all the Darises who never got a shot. She'd cried on the phone. "Baby, you did good. You did so good." Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. Zara sat beside Naomi, recording on her phone because she wanted to remember this. At 20, she was in her junior year at Spelman, studying political science and already making waves with her activism. "I grew up 3 blocks from here," Marcus began, his voice steady, "in a house where the heat didn't always work and the lights got shut off more times than I can count. I watched my mother work herself to the bone so I could have a chance. And when she died, I thought the best way to honor her was to escape, to build something so big, so undeniable, that no one could ever make me feel small again." He paused, letting the words settle. "But I was wrong. The best way to honor her isn't to escape. It's to come back, to invest in the place that raised me, to make sure the next kid who grows up here doesn't have to choose between survival and dreams." The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus waited for it to die down, then continued. "This center isn't charity. It's not a handout. It's infrastructure. It's access. It's the same kind of opportunities that rich kids in East Memphis take for granted. And if we're serious about changing outcomes, we have to start by changing inputs. He looked directly at the young people in the audience, kids who reminded him of himself at their age, hungry and hopeful and uncertain if the world would let them be great. You are not your zip code, he said firmly. You are not your circumstances. You are capable of anything. And this building exists to prove it. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the center alone. He ran his fingers along the walls, peeked into classrooms, stood in the middle of the basketball court, and remembered being 10 years old, shooting hoops with Darius, talking about futures they couldn't quite imagine. Hey, stranger. He turned. Miss Lorraine was standing in the doorway, leaning on a cane but smiling. Hey, Miss Lorraine. Marcus walked over, pulled her into a gentle hug. Darius would be so proud of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I wish he could see this. Me too, Marcus whispered. Every single day. They stood there for a moment. Two people bound by grief and love and the ghost of a boy who never got to grow up. You know what the crazy thing is? Marcus said. I used to think success meant leaving all this behind, proving I was better than where I came from. But the truth is, this place made me. The struggle, the doubt, the hunger, it's all part of who I am. And I wouldn't change it? Miss Lorraine squeezed his hand. That's called wisdom, baby. And it only comes from living. That night, Marcus, Naomi, and Zara had dinner at a soul food restaurant in South Memphis, the same one Marcus used to go to as a kid when his mother could afford it. The catfish was still perfect, crispy, and seasoned just right. And the sweet tea was so sweet it made your teeth hurt. Dad, Zara said, setting down her fork. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? The sacrifices you made? The things you gave up? Marcus thought about it. About the relationships that didn't survive his ambition. About the nights he missed with Zara because he was in a boardroom somewhere. About the years he spent running so fast he forgot to live. Yeah, he said honestly. I regret a lot, but I don't regret fighting. I don't regret building. And I don't regret teaching you that you deserve to take up space in this world. Zara's eyes filled with tears. I'm scared sometimes, Dad. Scared I won't be enough. Scared I'll let you down. Marcus reached across the table, took her hand. Baby girl, you could never let me down. You know why? Because you're not me. You don't have to carry what I carried. You get to build on what I built. That's the whole point. But what if I fail? Then you fail, and you get back up. That's what we do. He smiled. Besides, you've got something I didn't have at your age. What? People who believe in you from the start. You don't have to prove you belong. You already do. Zara wiped her eyes, laughed through her tears. When did you get so wise? When I finally stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be present. Later that night, Marcus and Naomi walked along the Mississippi River, the city lights reflecting on the water like scattered diamonds. They'd been together 15 years, now married for 7. She challenged him, grounded him, loved him through the worst of himself. You know what I realized today? Marcus said, his arm around her waist. What's that? I spent my whole life trying to own the sky, trying to build something so big it couldn't be ignored. But the thing that matters most fits in the palm of my hand. He stopped walking, turned to face her. You, Zara, the foundation, the people whose lives we've changed. That's the real empire. Not the money. Not the planes. Not the headlines. Naomi smiled, reached up and touched his face. Took you long enough to figure that out. Better late than never. She kissed him, soft and slow. And Marcus felt something he'd been chasing his entire life finally click into place. Peace. Marcus Caldwell was 61 when he wrote his memoir. It was titled Climbing While Black, Lessons from a Life Spent Proving the Impossible, and it became an instant bestseller. But more importantly, It became a roadmap for a generation of young people who saw themselves in his story. He didn't write it to brag. He wrote it to bear witness, to document the price of ambition, the cost of success, the weight of being the first, and to make damn sure he wasn't the last. The final chapter was addressed directly to the reader. You're going to face people who doubt you, systems designed to break you, moments where giving up feels easier than pushing forward. But here's what I need you to understand. Your existence is an act of resistance. Your success is a revolution. And every time you walk into a room where you're not supposed to be and take up space anyway, you're rewriting the rules for everyone who comes after you. So don't just survive. Thrive. Build. Dream so big it scares you. And when you make it, and you will make it, bring the ladder with you. Because we're not trying to create more exceptions. We're trying to change the rule. Now go. The sky is waiting. Marcus Caldwell never flew in seat 2A again. Not because he didn't want to, but because he no longer needed the validation of first class to know he belonged. He belonged in boardrooms, in classrooms, in his daughter's laughter, in his wife's arms, in the quiet moments where success wasn't measured by net worth, but by the lives he'd touched and the paths he'd cleared. And when people asked him how he did it, how he built an empire from nothing, he always gave the same answer. I didn't do it alone. I stood on my mother's shoulders, on Darius's memory, on every person who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And now? Now I'm making sure the next generation has stronger shoulders to stand on than I did. Marcus Caldwell built an empire, but his greatest achievement was teaching others to build their own. This is where Marcus's story ends. But yours is just beginning. If his journey inspired you, share this story. Because somewhere out there is a kid who needs to hear that they belong, that they're enough, that they can build their own sky. Thank you for staying until the end. Now go build something that outlasts you.